We're studying a series of restoration of New Testament Christianity. In the process of doing so, we'll be looking at earmarks of the New Testament church, how it may be identified by those earmarks. We'll be looking at a number of things already have, and we'll be looking at more. When Jesus talked about discipleship and how the church might be identified, he didn't use the things we're using in this series. But he said, "By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love one for another." So with that in mind, as we grieve with Sister Porter and her daughter and her granddaughter and all who are grieving over the loss of the brother who passed away, let's remember that that's the way people will identify us as God's people. The manifestation we have in the love we show toward one another, especially in time of grief. We're hoping that this series will help us all in some respects. Number one, those of us who have been exposed before need to be reminded of the ongoing need for a restoration of New Testament Christianity. And secondly, those who have not been exposed to the concept at all will learn something about that anew for themselves. Then thirdly, there may be those who are searching for the earmarks of the New Testament church and how to identify it in the world. And hopefully, if that is your situation, these lessons will be profitable for you as well. In this series, we'll be looking again at some of the things we discussed last week later on. We ended in our study last week of the worship of the church as it had to do with the music that God has ordained in the corporate worship of the church. And in so doing, we were talking about the fact that God's laws are both inclusive and exclusive in nature. We would belabor that a little bit today again, but Lord willing, when we get to the subject of hermeneutics, which will be one of our lessons in this series, we'll revisit that concept again and look at it in some more detail. But in our series, we mentioned the fact that back during the 19th century, when there had been a waning prior to a revival of interest in religion in our nation, and things were at a low ebb, spiritually and morally speaking, there became a very renewed interest in religious matters, and especially on the Western Reserve, and people began to look again for God, for His Word, for the truth, for the church. And so a restoration concept was born out of that kind of background. And we'll be looking in on some of the men who played a leading role in that a little later on. And it's going to be amazing for us, I think, to recognize when we do that this was done simultaneously by a number of persons in a number of different places, not only in the world, but especially in our own country, all making the same plea and seeking the same old paths without the knowledge of one another, until later on as they met up and learned that they're all looking in the same direction, searching for the same ancient order of things, and it came to pass that they combined their efforts and brought about a greater emphasis in a restoration plea. But today I want to look in on at least one of those men before we introduce the study for today, that I hope you'll find interesting and helpful too, because the climate of the time, which was already mentioned religiously, had a great deal to do with the need for the restoration movement itself. But among the chief things that concerned them was the division that existed then and persists even in a more direct way today in the 21st century. But a second thing was Calvinism, which was taught so strenuously by so many, and yet those who did not, those had an Arminian view and looked at it differently, were combating with them very strongly, and that created a climate that brought about some of the men who finally said, "I'm going to go back and study the Bible for myself and determine whether or not I can understand it, because I've been taught that I could not. without God's intervening on my behalf and helping me through the Holy Spirit in a direct measure to understand it. One such man was named John Smith. He was born in East Tennessee in a log cabin on October the 15th, 1784. His parents were of a Calvinistic persuasion of what we today know as the Primitive Baptist. They were not known so much as that by that title at that time, but just the Baptist Church. And they taught John Smith, his parents did, that there was a very terrible place called hell, and that unless God had predestined on his own arbitrarily determination that they'd go to heaven, they would go to hell. Whatever they did or did not do or believe would have no bearing on that whatsoever. And that even small children who were not predestined for heaven would also go to hell. Well, John Smith, hearing that preaching, not only from the pulpit, but also taught that by his parents, was very concerned about it, because he was anxious to know God, to know the Bible, and to learn to love God as he should. And so, having heard a preacher by the name of Isaac Denton set forth the Calvinistic plea, we call the tulip today, which had within its very beginning the fact that children are born totally depraved. So he approached the minister with these questions. And I'll say Smith when I'm quoting from John, and Denton when I'm quoting the response from the preacher. But Smith said, "What must I do to have this change of which you were speaking?" Denton, "Nothing, John. God's grace is sovereign and unconditional. If you are his sheep, you will be called, and you will hear his voice and follow him." Smith, "But when, Mr. Denton, will the Lord call me?" Denton, "In his own good time, John. He has worked out your whole life and determined your destiny according to his own wise but hidden and eternal purpose." Smith, "How then may I know whether I am one of his sheep or not?" Denton, "You will know it by the change when it comes. Till then, you can only wait on the Lord and hope." Smith, "If I am left to perish, I know it will be on account of my sins. But if I should be saved, would it not be on account of my goodness?" Denton, "The Lord sees no good in you, John. If you're ever brought to life, it will be solely because it was his good pleasure to choose you before the foundation of the world. And that too without any reference to your character or works foreseen by him. True, if you should be lost, if you perish, it will be on account of your sins and to the praise of his glorious justice." Smith, "My destiny, you say, is fixed, and I cannot change it. I need not then give myself any concern. I can do nothing. I have nothing I can do." Denton, Great is the mystery of godliness. There is much for you to do." Smith, "What is it, Mr. Denton?" Denton, "You must pray, pray, pray in the dust and ashes to the Lord." Smith, "Pray for what, sir?" Denton, "That the blinding scales may fall from your eyes, and that you may see and feel what you really are in the sight of God, for you're yet in the gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity." This exchange caused John Smith to think more seriously about his own spiritual life and begin to look for some answers in his own Bible. Therefore, he became a great giant in the effort in the century restoring primitive New Testament Christianity. Last week we looked in on the worship of the church. This had to do with the music God has ordained for us. Today we'll look in on at least maybe two aspects, but let's look in on the fifth avenue of worship that we haven't mentioned yet, not to much extent at least. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, turn to that familiar passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Now we learned the church assembled to pray. The church assembled to observe the Lord's Supper. Church assembled to engage in preaching or hearing the preaching or involved with preaching and hearing the word. And we have also learned that singing last week was important in the worship. Those four things. Today, we're looking at the fifth avenue and the only 5 avenues of worship. These would exhaust them that are mentioned in the New Testament. There is no reference to any kind of pageantry, entertainment, or things of that sort that were part of the corporate worship of the New Testament church. Was simple yet profound and Christ-centered. As I gave order unto the churches of Galatia, chapter 16, 1 Corinthians, verses 1 and 2, as I gave order or a commandment to the churches of Asia or Macedonia, even so do ye, Corinthians, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. A free will offering on the first day of the week was to be observed by all the churches. As he mentioned, he gave order to other churches, not simply to the church at Corinth. Then later on he writes to the Corinthians again in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, having reminded them of what he had written here in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that they lay by in store funds. Those funds, as we learn, were for the purpose of Paul coming by to collect them and carry them into Judea, where there was a drought and where saints were suffering for lack of commodities and food. And Paul was going to bring a group with him, come by Corinth and pick up that which they had laid by in store and carry it with him to aid those poor saints, as we'll see a little later, others as well. And so lay by in store, there be no gathering when I come, has reference not to Jesus coming, as we've heard some erroneously conclude, but when Paul is coming by the church at Corinth to pick up this bounty. But not have to gather it when I get there, have it in a common place, in a common treasure, as we'd say today. But now, in the second letter to them, chapter 9, he brings it up again and says, I'm about now ready to come and pick it up. But I've been bragging to the churches of Macedonia, who incidentally themselves have been very, very generous in their giving, beyond measure, and beyond what I expected, and beyond even what God required. They gave because they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. So he said, as I talk with them about you, as I've talked to you about them, when I talked to them about you, I told them how ready you were and how anxious you were to fulfill the commitment to help these poor saints in Judea, and that you're going to have a lot ready for me when I got there. Verse 5 of chapter 9. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort you and the brethren to go ahead and to prepare you and prepare your generous gift before I get there, or beforehand, because I may bring some of these Macedonians with me. So you have it ready beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity on your part, and not as a grudging obligation as you would view it. But this I say, he that sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. I don't want you to be grudging your giving. I want you to be generous in it, but I don't want you to do it grudgingly, doing it because you have to do it. We might sometimes view that matter. We'll say a little more about that in a moment. He that soweth bountifully, that is, gives bountifully of his money or goods, will also reap bountifully. And he that soweth sparingly, sows only a little, will reap also sparingly. So let each one of you give as he purposeth in his own heart, not grudgingly, nor of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. I think I've mentioned this before, and I'm a little reluctant to mention it again because it's something that's more of a pet peeve with me than it has to do with what right or wrong. But I believe we would appreciate this action of worship in our giving if we come to recognize the privilege of it. And Paul is kind of addressing that here, isn't he, in these words we're reading. It is a commandment, that's true, as I gave order to the churches. It's a commandment, to be sure. And it's not remiss to say God has given us this commandment, that we should give upon the first day of the week as we've been prosperous. Nothing wrong with that. That's a correct statement. But I think we would appreciate what we're doing more if we look at it differently. Saying, God has granted me the privilege of showing him how much I love him and his cause. God has granted us opportunity to show our love to him. As a matter of fact, Paul used that very expression in this in the 8th chapter of the 2 Corinthians, just before he ends chapter 8. He says, your giving, or like thereof, says to the Macedonians who will be coming with me, the proof of your love. Well, the reverse of that would be true, wouldn't it? If they do not find that you've given generously, they will see, as God sees as well, that you did not love God enough, or you did not love your brethren enough who are suffering, as the case may have been, that you did not give for that cause, and therefore the proof of your love. It's not said in the New Testament, of course, what order the avenues of worship should be conducted, whether it should sing first, preach first, pray first, and what have you, the Lord's Supper first, the Lord's Supper last. But traditionally, for over the generations, most of our congregations, until much more recent times, observe the Lord's Supper we do here, the last thing in the worship assembly. And when I was preaching at East Point for 13 years, we took up collection after, or at the close of the service, rather than have the Lord's Supper before the preaching. So we did it at a different time, and the New Testament doesn't regulate the time that we do a certain action of worship. But it is appropriate, I think, that generally we have the Lord's Supper and then the collection on the first day of the week, because we have just been thanking God for his unspeakable gift. And Paul talks about that too in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 in connection with giving. Thank God for his unspeakable gift. Now, God has granted us the privilege of showing him how much we love him in return. As John said in 1 John 4, we love him, why? Because he first loved us. And so there's no better way. There are many ways, of course. If you love me, keep my commandments, Jesus said in John 14. So everything we do in obeying God shows our love for him. But there is no better way, and meaningful way, in showing our love for God than in the contribution we make to his cause on the Lord's Day. And before I forget this, may I suggest to you that this is the only means suggested in the New Testament that our revenue be collected for the church, and its advancement is upon the first day of the week, and that being a free will contribution that we purpose in our own heart. That isn't to say we couldn't give, as we couldn't say we couldn't sing some of the time than in the worship, that we couldn't pray some other time except in worship, or couldn't preach the gospel to anyone except during worship. We can certainly give to people who need it at other times other than the first day of the week. But so far as the revenue for the congregation is ongoing, this is what has happened. That was what is exposed in the New Testament. They didn't get together and sell their goods out on the parking lot to put money in the collection plate. They didn't have a supper and a meal that they charged people to come and buy their barbecue so they could have some fun to put in the collection plate, but a free will offering the Lord's people on the Lord's day. And so we always, our brethren, have followed that biblical precedent, and we encourage them to continue to do so. Malachi chapter 3, the Old Testament, speaks to the point of what Paul said to Corinthians here in 2 Corinthians 9. I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Yes.
I read in the Old Testament where they built the tabernacle.
Uh-huh.
In the New Testament, did they ever actually build a church? Build a place of meeting?
Place of meeting? Well, that's would be a part of the package, but probably not the primary reason. In the New Testament era, very few people had this kind of accommodation. They either borrowed the Jewish synagogue as long as they allowed it, or worshiped in their homes of their brethren. Buildings came along a little bit later, but by way of implication, which we are to meet upon the first day of the week and assemble regularly, and the scriptures doesn't tell us how to do it, then we're at liberty to build such a building. But in principle, what you're saying would be true, of course. When it's suggesting when they built the tabernacle, they had to be restrained in the temple for bringing in so much. The people were so willing to give and see that this work is completed that they had to be restrained from giving. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that in the church today? They brethren, giving too much, slow down. But that did happen in the tabernacle, and certainly if they were willing to give for that structure, we ought to be willing to give, of course, for the structure in which we meet. But by way of implication, will be the case.
Something to think about. That's always been an interesting question from a historical standpoint. But in the earliest days of Christianity, primarily Jews were kind of the foundation for the church where it began. The gospel was first preached to them. So in many churches, like at Carmel, for example, there was a synagogue there. There were synagogues throughout the Mediterranean basin.
Right.
And those served as places of worship. But as the Jewish element began to become more antagonistic toward the church and eventually that division, there was a necessity then for Christian churches to establish their own places of meeting.
Right. They were chased out of synagogues, in other words. But as long as they were permitted, and even Jesus himself, of course, before the law ended, preached in the synagogues. The synagogue was buildings like this, in which the Jews had become accustomed to worshiping under the law of Moses. But these are good questions. But now, Malachi 3, we're familiar with the fact that God had told the Jewish people of his time, Malachi's people, that you're robbing God. You say, well, how are we robbing God? By your failing to give of your tithes and offerings, he said. You have robbed God in that process. And then he says, by way of a positive view of it, give of your tithes. Bring them into my storehouse and see me and prove me whether or not I will bless you. I will open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so great your barns will not be able to contain it. So prove me.